Apathy among Christian voters could be a game changer in the 2024 election. This, according to a recently published study from George Barna at the Cultural Research Center. The findings reveal that a whopping 32 million Christians are sitting out in 2024. Is this justified inaction, a lack of motivation, or something else entirely? Let's talk about it today in episode 52. I'm Blake Watson, and this is We the Free. One of the best ways you can help our show, other than by sharing today's episode, is by picking up some We the Free merch at wethefreeshow.com. You can be the salt and light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt, or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt and the We the Free crest tee. We've got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle, so check out our merch today at wethefreeshow.com. To vote or not to vote? Yes, that is reportedly the question that tens of millions of Christians are currently asking themselves, according to pre-election research from Dr. George Barna at the Cultural Research Center. These findings, which were published on October 7th, are deeply concerning. With less than 3 weeks until Election Day and the potential abstinence of nearly a fifth of the electorate on the line, the gravity of this conversation today cannot be understated. Let's get right into the findings and then we'll dig into the substance. I'm going to quote extensively from the report and I'll show you the data so you can follow along. To begin the conversation, the research determined as many as 104 million people of faith are unlikely to vote in this upcoming election, and among those, 32 million self-identified Christians who regularly attend church won't cast their ballots. The survey also revealed that large numbers of Christian churches have distanced themselves from the election, refusing to even encourage congregants to vote and avoiding teaching related to many of the key social issues that will determine which candidates people will support. The levels of enthusiasm are consistent with that of the 2012 and 2016 elections, but enthusiasm has dropped significantly since the prior election in 2020. What are the reasons for decreased enthusiasm? Well, the research determined 4 reasons. 1, distaste for both the candidates. Number 2, general dissatisfaction with the government. Number 3, election fraud. And number 4, voting by illegal immigrants. We will extensively address the first issue today, but let's take a moment to examine the rest. A dissatisfaction with the federal government should have the opposite effect of a lack of electoral enthusiasm. It should motivate your involvement. The founding fathers would be repulsed by such a sentiment. Dissatisfaction is the very reason the United States of America exists today as an independent nation. The Declaration of that brave, ingenious bunch declared that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In other words, it is your civil responsibility as Americans to utilize the democratic power of your vote. That leads us to the latter 2 reasons for enthusiastic loss, and that is this idea that our vote lacks said power, which is specifically attributed to election fraud and illegal participation. If only these 32 million Christians in America were freebies, this would not be their concern. 4 years ago, there were 2 legitimate, factually proven means of election illegality and manipulation. The first was the vast prevalence of absentee or mail-in ballots under the guise of a public health crisis and the unconstitutional changing of election processes which ensued. The United States Constitution only vests the authority of determining election processes to one political body, the legislatures in each state. Each state's legislature bears the sole legal authority to decide how elections are conducted in their state. Any other means of determining the election process is plainly illegal. Yet that's exactly what happened in 2020, which served as the basis for so much legal contention and doubtfulness concerning election integrity. In Pennsylvania, the DNC filed several lawsuits to extend the deadline for absentee ballots, allow for the use of drop boxes, and the easing of restrictions when it comes to mail-in ballots, the form of voting which is the most susceptible to fraud. In Wisconsin, Democratic groups sued to change deadlines and witness requirements, for which they succeeded. In Georgia, these lawsuits promoted the use of drop boxes and relaxed signature verification requirements. In addition to these states, the same lawsuits were completed in Michigan and Texas. So what has changed since then? Well, first and foremost is that there is no public health crisis or concern to validate such measures again, because that was the whole basis last time. But more importantly, much has been done to address these concerns. Georgia, Texas, and Florida have tightened restrictions on mail-in voting and drop boxes. Pennsylvania and Michigan have expanded early voting opportunities. Nevada and Colorado have improved signature verification standards. On that note, Texas, Georgia, and Florida now have stricter ID requirements. Pennsylvania and Georgia have improved their tabulation process to have more expedient results. The second proven means of election interference was the censorship of the infamous laptop story concerning then presidential candidate Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. The story was published as an October surprise by the New York Post in the weeks before the election. The report detailed emails and other data from a laptop belonging to Hunter Biden, linking him to unethical business dealings with the likes of Ukraine and China. The Post also implied that Joe Biden, as vice president, was involved in said dealings. However, just as the story began to surface, Google, Twitter, and Facebook censored the information under the direction of the FBI. Several polls conducted after the election suggested that if voters had been more aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story, an election-changing portion of them would have reconsidered their vote for Joe Biden. For example, a Media Research Center poll found that 17% of Biden voters said they might not have voted for him if they had been aware of the story. Thanks to Elon Musk's exposing of the corruption of the now revolutionized platform through the infamous Twitter files dump, we know that Twitter outright blocked the information. Mark Zuckerberg corroborated this fact, saying that Facebook complied by censoring the alleged Russian disinformation, but we've not heard that same kind of admission from Google, though investigations have confirmed the same level of algorithmic misdirection. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what has changed since then? What's changed in 4 years? Well, Zuckerberg has publicly apologized and has guaranteed change and an apolitical stance. And thanks to Elon Musk, Twitter not only goes by a different name, X, but is under new leadership and governance. In addition to that, I'm seeing virtually zero censorship regarding any information about either candidate. And that may perhaps be the reason why the Democrats and their partners in the mainstream media are struggling to boost Kamala Harris's poll numbers. They're dropping because they can't force these major social platforms to silence people like myself who are dispersing damning information about the vice president. That brings us to the fourth and final cause for voter disinterest: illegal participation. I've already done extensive research, segments, and whole episodes on this subject, and the concerns are legitimate. It is a fact that In this election, there could very well be enough illegal votes cast to sway the outcome of the election. Regardless of the fork-tongued speech of the left right now that a non-citizen can't register to vote, even though it happens by the millions, while at the same time they vote unanimously against legislation to enact federal standards to require proof of citizenship to vote. But the solution is quite simple. Everyone needs to vote. Everyone needs to vote because they can't out-cheat the numbers. If we will all go vote and the numbers reveal 115% participation, the entire sham operation is exposed. So everyone must get out and vote. However, add to this necessary participation the fact that right now, the Biden-Harris administration are suing the states of Alabama and Virginia for removing non-citizens from their voter registration rolls. Now, let's talk about the headline information and the numbers they produced. Barna found that nearly 80% of Americans identify themselves as people of faith. Just from the start, that's a ridiculous overstatement, even if you account for the established organized religions in the U.S., like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, etc. Just look around you. Are we to believe that 4 out of every 5 Americans are people of faith? Of course not. But that doesn't matter. These are Americans, authentically religious or not, but take a look at what they found. Among those classified as a person of faith, only 51% indicated they are likely to vote. If the survey statistics are projected on the basis of national population estimates based on a census-derived U.S. voting age population of 268 million and an estimated 212 million adults qualifying as a quote-unquote person of faith, the 49% who are not likely to vote in November represents about 104 million eligible non-voters in the people of faith segment. That's where they're getting this main number, this 104 million number. But this is just part of the base finding. That 104 million people of faith are deciding to sit out this election. Now, just for the record, Barna usually does a fantastic job of their sampling methodology. I checked the methodology on this research and it seems as close to representative as they can get. That's what they want every time. But there's one more bit of additional information to consider before we move on. Based on my own calculations of the 4 previous presidential elections, there was a big jump in participation in 2020 compared to 2008, 2012, and 2016. But on average, around 61% of the voting eligible population actually goes out and votes. For example, in 2008, when President Obama was first elected, there were 213 million eligible voters, but there were only 131 million votes cast. If we apply those average numbers throughout the years to 2024, then we'll have nearly 165 million votes cast in this election. Now, compare my numbers with Barna's findings. They found that 104 million Americans are saying, no, I will not vote in this election, and that constitutes about 39% of the voting age population. So when you add that to the 61% average participation rate, there you have the whole electorate. But the numbers only add up when considering this quote-unquote people of faith category. Do you see what I'm saying? People don't vote for a number of reasons: lack of interest, apathy, distrust in the political system, lack of knowledge, dislike of the candidates, or they simply weren't able to vote. People get sick, people have emergencies. In other words, those 104 million people can say they're not voting, but the record shows us that a large portion of them wouldn't be voting anyway. So this might feel like splitting hairs, but you can probably subtract a lot from this overestimated number and then add some right back for the other many reasons for not voting in the election. Now, Take a look at this. This is what we really need to talk about. And I'm reading to you from the results. Barna pointed out that a deeper dive into the data shows more narrowly defined segments within the people of faith group have different expected turnout rates. Among those are people who are defined by their beliefs regarding sin and salvation as born-again Christians. 41 million expected not to vote. Now, this is the one right here that I want you to take note of. Self-identified Christians who regularly attend church services. 32 million not expected to vote. That's that fourth row on the chart. And voting-age adults who regularly attend an evangelical church, 14 million. The research also indicated 46 million adults who attend Protestant churches and 19 million who attend Catholic churches are not likely to vote. All right, so there's the rest of the headline. The study found that approximately 32 million so-called Christians are choosing not to participate on November 5th in the presidential election. 32 million. And as I said in the introduction, that's almost 20% or 1/5 of likely voters. So this is where we get back to those 4 reasons for voter disinterest. We talked about 3 of them already: dissatisfaction with the government, election integrity, and illegal participation. But the focus of our conversation will be for the first reason listed, which is a distaste for both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. In other words, a fifth of the electorate, 32 million Americans, self-identified, regular church-attending Christians, are not going to vote in the election, in part because they don't like Harris or Trump. I've been sitting on this piece from Douglas Wilson over at Blog and Mablog since August. It's a really great piece, and it's a good site if you want some theological and cultural reading. Wilson, a pastor, author, and speaker, wrote the following piece titled, "Why Your Vote is No Sacrament." He begins the piece asking the same question we began with: to vote or not to vote? Wilson writes, "Among those Christians who do not vote, or who feel they must cast write-in purity votes, there are 2 main motivations. Those motivations are, in the first place, cynicism, and secondly, perfectionism." And of course, people being the way they are, sometimes these 2 motivations can be combined or jumbled up together. The cynical individual says something like, "Don't vote, it only encourages them." This naturally throws a dark shadow over everything you've been told by pretty much everybody, and which would include the platitude that, quote, "every vote matters," end quote. So far, what Wilson has attested bears out in the research. But I want to draw your attention to something he said in the first paragraph, which I believe is the most common scenario. He says there are 2 types of Christians who do not vote: cynics and perfectionists. But that these 2 motivations can be combined or jumbled up together. Now, I've been bickering with conservatives and Christians online for the past few months. And I can verify that this is the sentiment. The conservatives and Christians who are opting to either not participate at all or write in someone else's name are doing so from a place of cynicism and or perfectionism. You'll see what I mean as we continue with Wilson's piece. In the last few years, virtually every major American institution has discredited and disgraced itself, and it's hard to find any source that is worthy of simple trust anymore. This indisputable fact is where the main cynical energy is coming from. What matters is that cynics have somehow detached themselves from the discredited and hated establishment. So he's describing how cynics have abolished their trust in the discredited and hated establishment, which serves as the driving force for their disinvolvement. This aligns with reason number 2 from earlier. Americans are going to be less involved in the 2024 election, in part, because of their general dissatisfaction with the government. And I would say that extends to the candidates the machine has to offer. Now listen closely to this next part. Wilson writes, "Then there is the perfectionist, the one who believes that because we should all vote our consciences, and because the Bible requires us to keep our consciences unsullied, this means that we must abstain from voting for any impure candidate or party." Pause there for a moment. The Christian, non-voting perfectionist is bestowing a sacramental status on the very act of voting, as if voting is a holy rite of passage. Therefore, this Christian aspiring to be holy in all they do, 1 Peter 1, 15 through 16, avoids that which may sully his conscience, Romans 14, 23. Wilson continues, "Voting is thought of in quasi-sacramental or even sacramental terms. And as we all know, sacraments are not to be entered into thoughtlessly or with any deliberate known sin in our lives. Voting for a compromised candidate, one with known sin in his life, would itself be an instance of such compromise. Thus, the person thinking this way either stays home or writes in a candidate or votes for a third party that is splintered enough to be suitably pure." So to state it simply, there are many Christians who may not vote for either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump because neither of them are remotely righteous, and supporting either of them at the ballot box is personally viewed as an act of immorality, an outright endorsement of either the individual or their respective parties. But Wilson delves even further by dividing the perfectionists into two different camps, hard perfectionists and soft perfectionists. He writes, "The hard perfectionists will generally be part of a movement or a faction. A good example of this would be the hardcore abolitionists on the abortion question. It is important to note that I am not referring to all abolitionists here, but some of them most certainly fit the bill. Many of these will refuse to vote for Trump because of his manifest cluelessness on the abortion issue. Despite the fact that he was the reason Roe was struck down, for which we thank God, he has nevertheless signaled in various ways that he does not comprehend what the life issue even is. He understands that he has to deal with pro-lifers who think a certain way about abortion, but he plainly has no idea why we think that way." Now this right here is right on the money. This is the number one reason for the Christian withdrawal from former President Trump, because of his outspoken, politically moderate stance on abortion. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. And to use another idiom, these Christians have drawn a line in the sand on that issue. My point in all of this is that yes, this campaign policy is horrific. It's terrible. This is the most important issue to us because it concerns the most fundamental right of all, life. And it's being deprived from the most deserving and innocent of humanity. But there are a host of other issues that we have to consider. I refer to them as battles. Abortion is but one battlefield among many on which we must wage war. But there are a host of other battles and battlefields which must be fought, which affect humanity and American society. There is the battle for national security, the battle for world peace, the battle for economic stability, the battle for justice, law, and order, sexuality, education, the family, etc., etc. The overlap here between my own writing and Wilson's is that the hard Christian perfectionist has political tunnel vision, mainly concerning the issue of abortion. But we'll come back to this idea in a moment. What about soft perfectionists? Wilson writes, "The soft perfectionists will generally be very sweet and very pious Christians and usually born before 1964. They think longingly about the days when the political process was not nearly as tawdry as it is now. Many of these individuals will refuse to vote for Trump because he is manifestly not their idea of a gentleman. He's a walking incarnation of New York bravado in a brash red tie. He says things that, speaking frankly, ought not be said. He makes fastidious people feel icky, and they don't think that ickiness belongs in the voting booth. This is a much more eloquent, better written version of how I've described the aversion to Trump by the old Republicans. I've often described Trump's lack of the traditional character that most would describe as presidential, but Wilson's description of this idea extends into spirituality and, frankly, a better articulated point on gentlemanliness. I completely agree with his assessment. Now, watch how he further defines the two classes of Christian perfectionists. The hard perfectionists are usually young radicals, and the soft perfectionists are usually old ladies of both sexes. The former doesn't want to vote for a less than perfect candidate because he doesn't line up with the rigid dictates of the ideological agenda. The latter doesn't want to because the less than perfect candidate is someone who violates their code of the gentleman. But both perfectionist approaches are misconstruing what a vote actually is. And this is because, ironically, they still believe the platitude mentioned earlier, that being the error of placing the spotlight on each vote as though it matters in a particular way. We're going to flesh out that last part, but as far as describing the abstinent Christian voter and their distinctive classes, Wilson paints an excellent picture. If you're one of the 32 million saying to yourself and possibly others that you're not going to participate, I can't allow myself to be a part of this, I can't this, or I can't that, you're either a cynic, someone who's lost all faith in the electoral system, and if not that, then the governmental system, or you're a hardline perfectionist, someone who's convinced that voting for someone such as these two would be a sin against God, your conscience, and possibly others, or you're a soft perfectionist repulsed by the lack of character, gentleman qualities, or ladylike qualities. And you've convinced yourself, or someone you respect has persuaded you to distance yourself from these worldly affairs. In this next part, Wilson gives us a couple contrasting examples to our day and age. First, he alludes to Samuel at Jesse's house from 1 Samuel 16. This is where God has directed Samuel to anoint a young David as the future king of Israel, choosing him not by his outward appearance, but by his heart. Wilson also alludes to Jethro's advice to Moses in Exodus 18. Moses is the only person in charge, and it's wearing him out. So his father-in-law Jethro tells him he should select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, hundreds, and fifties, and tens. Wilson says, suppose you were a wise hermit living on the mountain, and down below you in the valley there was a small kingdom. The way their constitutional affairs were organized, whenever the throne was vacant, they would bring 5 eligible candidates up to see you. And you, like Samuel at Jesse's house, would select the man. Now, in such a circumstance, you really would be obligated to pick the man who feared God, loved truth, and hated covetousness, Exodus 18:21. The choice is up to you. And so you need to pick the good man and not the bad man. But our situation is not like this at all. We're actually playing blob tag with about 160 million other people, and we're doing so over quite rocky terrain. The problem arises when an individual voter thinks that what he is doing is the identical thing that the hermit on the mountain is doing. He is one raindrop who is making himself feel fully responsible for the flood. But this places a false construction on the whole business. In other words, the perfectionist Christian imposes an absurd burden upon himself as if he were Samuel choosing the next king of Israel. What's more is that Americans have not even had a God-fearing, truth-loving, covetous-hating candidate in a blue moon. Now watch this. This is really important. How can the differences between a parliamentary system and our presidential republic give us insight here? Think about it. The UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, Italy, etc., all these countries are parliamentary systems. So when the people of Canada go to vote, they're not voting for a president. They're voting for an MP, a member of parliament, which would be like a representative to us. It's just like our Congress. All of these MPs make up the legislative parliament, but then the majority party in parliament gets to choose their prime minister. Then the prime minister is the one who forms the government and the cabinet, etc. So contrast that with our American system. We're voting for both our legislators and presidents at the same time. What sort of problems does that create for us as Christians and people of faith? Well, Wilson says, in a parliamentary system, all the log rolling and deal making is conducted after the election. Everybody gets to vote for their pure splinter party, which shields the individual voter from qualms of conscience because the party bosses are then the ones who get their hands dirty after the fact by forming a coalition with various weirdos and miscreants. The voter can still feel okay because that is what they did over there, where I don't have to answer questions about what they're doing now. In the American system, the deals are cut with the odd bedfellows before the election. The recent teaming up of RFK Jr. with Trump being a case in point, this means that Americans feel like they have to vote for the whole shebang, dirty compromises and all. Another example would be Trump signaling to the moderates on abortion that they shouldn't be too worried, which has the effect of making all the pro-lifers who are going to vote for him a bit too worried. So you can see the problem that this presents to the hardline perfectionist Christians in America. Now, I have to admit, if you go back and listen to my work from earlier this year, I criticized Trump very heavily for the anti-life statements he was making. But as time went on, I began to realize that he, as only politicians can do, Trump was saying what he felt would peel moderates away from VP Harris, or then Joe Biden. I don't know whether he believes that or not. I'm guessing as a lifelong New York Democrat, these are the views he's always held on abortion. But what I also had to realize was that out of the top 10 issues, while Trump was weak on this one, he was great on the 9 other battlefields. Harris is weak on all battlefields, on all points. Still, though, the Christian struggles with mustering the finger strength to push the Trump button at the ballot box. So, Wilson gives us a couple exercises. Would it be lawful for a Christian to work as an undercover agent for a law enforcement agency, telling people his name was Brian when it was Kurt, and having a driver's license that said he was from Kansas when he was from Delaware? I would say, sure. But would it be lawful for an undercover agent to sleep with various women who are not his wife in order to maintain his cover? Clearly not. The perfectionist wants to say that voting for a pro-choice candidate is necessarily the equivalent of that kind of adultery. You just shouldn't do it, period. But it really is not the same kind of thing at all. In other words, Wilson says the Christian perfectionist would liken their support of either candidate to that of a detective committing adultery to maintain his cover. But I would bet that you supported Trump in 2020 and maybe even in 2016. What if I told you his positions on abortion haven't changed at all? What if I told you that Mitt Romney held the same positions, as did John McCain, George W. Bush, Bob Dole, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter? I would bet almost every single one of you voted for one, if not all of those candidates. And where was your sacramental view then? Now here's the second exercise. Here, Wilson creates a hypothetical scenario. The president has nominated a strong pro-lifer to the Supreme Court. The Senate is going to confirm that choice, but the Senate is narrowly held by the Republicans. At just that moment, one of the staunch Republicans has a heart attack and dies, and a special election is held back in your home state. The choice is between a raging commie and a squish rhino, one who is decidedly pro-choice. But if elected, he will caucus with the Republicans and they will retain control of the Senate. If he's defeated, the Republicans will lose control of the Senate and will not be able to confirm the SCOTUS nominee. Now what does purity look like? It would be better to ask what purity with a brain looks like. Surely at this point one realizes that the American political system is a game which must be played carefully and strategically, not emotionally or flippantly. The analogy that I've used is that of describing this as a war. Because indeed, it is a cultural war, a political war, and a spiritual war with many fronts. If we concentrate all our resources on one battlefield, we will surely lose the others. We have to be wise to know when to fight, when to retreat, where to focus our resources in order to win the war. Furthermore, in reality, there's nothing more that can be done federally to either restrict or enshrine abortion. The issue is now a state-by-state battle, which must be fought, and you can watch my recent special on abortion to learn more about that. Wilson continues, "This is not a case of let us do evil that good may result. Rather, it is an instance of doing as much limited good as we can so that more good might come from it." What is that limited good? If Harris is elected, there will be no evangelicals in the White House or anywhere near it. David French might be allowed to come to a dinner a time or two to be given his crust until they're done with him, but that will pretty much be it. If Trump is elected, the place will be crawling with believers. And at the end of the day, personnel is policy. Now, let's take another look at our first graphic from the Barna research. Scan down to the fourth row in the third column and look at that number. For those who self-identified as a Christian who regularly attends church, 61% said they will be voting. Now look at this next table. The survey examined political or election-related activity undertaken by the respondents' church during the past 2 years. The most common action was their church providing one or more sermons or teachings about the Bible's stance on specific issues. Look at the yes percentage. 61%. The same number. There is a direct correlation there, folks. 61% of regular church attenders are voting in November because their pastor talked about it, preached a sermon on it, or taught on the issues. What else does that show us? Flip it inside out. That shows us that the reason 32 million Christians are abstaining from the election is because their churches aren't holding it as a priority. It's insignificant. And as I mentioned earlier, it's likely deemed worldly, carnal, or Christian nationalist to get involved. So, how can we make a difference here? The study detailed, overall, about 1 in every 6 likely non-voters said they would probably vote if their church taught them that voting is a biblical responsibility for every Christian. 1 out of 7 of the likely non-voters indicated that they would be likely to vote if family or friends convinced them of the importance of voting. If the election was so close they believed their vote might actually make a difference, or if they received an unbiased, objective briefing about what each of the major candidates supports and opposes. What are those numbers? More than 5 million Christians would get in the game if their church taught them the civil and spiritual responsibility in voting. 5 million. 4.5 million would be more likely to vote if we just talked about it. That's what we're doing today. On this point, author and Daily Wire contributor Megan Basham wrote, Barna said his research shows that pastors encouraging Christians to simply vote would make a huge impact, saying an estimated 5 million regular churchgoers would be likely to vote as a result of that simple exhortation. That in itself could change the outcome of the election by pastors simply doing their job and getting congregants to fulfill one of the chief duties as an American citizen. The question for many of us is, why are there so many pastors either avoiding the subjects or encouraging disengagement? To that, we have several responses. Author and podcaster Allie Beth Stuckey said, Pastor, it is not godly to tell your congregation no party will save you and leave it at that. That is not nuance, it's cowardice. While it is true no party is salvific, it is not true that parties are morally equivalent. The Democrat platform is constructed of the things God hates: child sacrifice, the undermining of the family, gender confusion, and institutionalized sexual degeneracy. These are not primarily political issues, they are theological issues. That's such a good point. But additionally, she said, you don't have to explicitly endorse a candidate, but you do need to clearly contrast the two parties' priorities in light of Scripture. The world is chaotic and confusing enough. The church should be a refuge of clarity and courage. Your congregation needs and deserves clarity, Pastor. Give it to them. There was another point in the last century when the church was failing to be the salt and light it was meant to be. Eric Metaxas wrote an entire book on this subject called Letter to the American Church, in which he described the inaction of the German church in the 1930s and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. There was one pastor, basically just one pastor, who was actually engaging and actually involved, and his name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He once said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." The way we could rephrase that today is not to vote is to vote. The late, great Rush Limbaugh's brother, David Limbaugh, said last week, many who claim to be conservative and reject leftism, yet brag they're too principled to vote for Trump, might as well be holding a sign that they are consumed with the sin of pride and elevating self above country. Abstention is voting. Voting for Kamala Harris is even worse. One X-user named Carrie responded to David's post so perfectly, stating, "When someone says, 'I can't believe you would vote for Trump,' I simply reply, 'I'm not voting for Trump, I'm voting for the First Amendment and freedom of speech, the Second Amendment and my right to defend my life and family, the continued growth of my retirement, reducing inflation, the return of our troops from foreign countries and to end America's involvement in foreign conflicts, the Electoral College, law and order, conservative federal judges, jobs in America, secure borders, peace progress in the Middle East, and freedom of religion." The commonality between Germany's pastors, and America's pastors and clergy today is fear, but fear over different things. The German pastors feared the Nazis. American pastors fear unpopularity and loss of financial support. Joel Berry, an editor at the Babylon Bee, said, "Most megachurch pastors are moral cowards. If they're ambivalent about politics in an election where one side loudly champions killing babies and sexually mutilating children, they're not pastors. They're businessmen who have built businesses around people liking them." I would add, perhaps, that's not a strong enough condemnation when considering Bonhoeffer's quote, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil." They know better, and yet they're silent on more than just the election. I'm proud to serve a pastor who does not fit that description in the least. Ironically, the left would label everything that I'm saying as Christian nationalism. How dare you? Well, leftists, consider the following. The survey pointed out that black churches are more likely than all other Christian churches to engage in each of the 7 forms of election-related activity studied. Traditionally, black churches are more than twice as likely as all other Christian churches to register people to vote and to provide voters guides for congregants. Do you know who knows this fact, this information? Kamala Harris's campaign. That's why they just launched the Souls to the Polls effort to turn out black churchgoers as Election Day approaches. ABC News reports, with fewer than 30 days until Election Day, the campaign's multi-pronged effort will see Harris herself visit black churches in battleground states. The Get Out the Vote program also comes with the creation of a faith advisory board made up of 10 prominent faith leaders. The push kicks off Sunday with a national call featuring gospel performances, faith leaders, and elected officials, the campaign said. The board said in a statement they are supporting Harris in part because she is, quote, "the only candidate who has always been a friend and advocate to the black church and faith communities across the country," end quote. The political influence of the church is something Harris has publicly recognized and leaned on. At that 2023 Orlando conference, Harris called on attendees to, quote, "let us shine a light on the path forward. And as we do so, let us fight with optimism, with faith, and with hope. Because as the history of our nation and the history of the church tells us, when we fight, we win." Whoa, sounds like Christian nationalism to me. Well, in closing, Douglas Wilson concluded his article by saying, "When you are voting, you are not performing a discrete action like putting the 8-ball into the corner pocket. And you're not on an undercover mission sleeping with other women. You are not the holy hermit appointing the righteous man to be king. Rather, you are leaning in the direction of a more desirable state of affairs together with millions of others. Imagine the canoe of state containing millions. You can lean to port or to starboard, or you can just sit there thinking pure thoughts, getting in the way. So what should you do this coming November? I will simply tell you what I'm going to do in the light of all the reasoning above, and you can put together my recommendation from that. I am going to vote for Trump. And when I leave the polling station, I will do so without any stain on my conscience, and I will climb into my truck chortling. I will do this because I would greatly prefer the state of affairs that would result from his election to the state of affairs that will result from the alternative. This is not because I want a pleasant state of affairs for me, righteousness be damned, but rather because I want righteousness to not lose any more maneuvering room. This November, let us not strain out a gnat while swallowing a camel. Get out and vote. If you need some guidance, I've put together a special playlist for you These videos fully explain the candidates' positions on the top 8 issues this election, and every single one of them, are important enough to warrant everyone's participation. Well, that's going to do it for me. What'll it be next time? We'll see. Now, go and be that salt and light you were meant to be, and we'll see you next time on We the Free. Thanks for watching today. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it, so do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to go check out wethefreeshow.com to grab yourself some merch, to spread the word about We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on screen that we think you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.